Today we're going to make a hanging knotted propagation jar. Perfect for putting little cuttings in and sort of watching the roots grow. We've got our glass jar secured in place with a macrame knotted design. We are using a hemp twine today. This is a 2mm twine. It's sort of just like a string, I guess. It's got no stretch in it. For a knotted design like this, we need one long length and 3 smaller lengths. You can use a mason jar or any sort of glass jar, like a jam jar. I'm just actually using a drinking glass. And my drinking glass is about 11 centimeters tall and 8 centimeters wide. So these measurements are for something around that size. Obviously, if your jar is a lot bigger, you're going to have to adjust your measurements. For my size drinking glass, I've got one length of 55 inches and 3 lengths of 30 inches. So I just start out by cutting all my lengths of my hemp twine. Then I'm going to find the middle of them all. So just putting the ends together and following it to the middle. And doing the same with the smaller pieces as well. Then we're going to put the middles together. So all the middles of the smaller pieces with the longer piece as well. And then we're going to just tie a knot here in the middle. And this is going to be the center knot for your knotted design. It's going to sit right at the base of the jar. Just pulling on each twine as well, making sure they're nice and tight. This is the part that's going to sit right there at the bottom. So to start with, mine's a little bit rounded. So I'm just going to start by figuring out how big my knots are going to be to sit around the base of the jar. So I sort of want mine to sit probably about there. So we're just bringing one piece of twine out from each side of the knot and just tying them in a knot as well. Just using overhand knots there, so around the finger and pulling it through. Then I'm going to swap onto the other side and do the same thing. So just bringing one twine out from each side and we're going to tie them in a knot as well, about the same distance away as this other knot. Pulling them nice and tight. And then we can do the same on these two cords that are in between. Tie them in a knot the same distance away. And then the same on the opposite side as well. So you should have 4 knots now, aside from the central knot. And this is starting to form your netting. The next one, I'm just holding my center knot and then we're going to do the same again. So pulling one thread out of each knot, the ones that are sitting next to each other, and we're just going to tie them in a knot as well. Then I swap onto the opposite side and do the same thing with the twines that are next to each other. Holding that center knot and pulling them down so that you can get the knot about the same distance away. You do want to make sure that none of your knots are big enough, or you're making the holes big enough that the glass is going to be able to fit through. At the bottom of our design here, I tie the knots a little bit closer together than I'm going to the next few, just to make sure that our glass has a really nice solid base and it's not going to be able to fit through any of the holes. We've done our next layer of knots and you should be able to start to see it's forming that nice little netting and going to create a nice solid base for our jar. So we can test out the size of it by just holding it on there and making sure it's going to sit around our base. The knots do need to be far enough away that it sits nicely around your jar, but not too close together either. So this part of the jar here is the biggest part of the jar, and so this next knot here, I can sort of hold my netting on here and start to see where the knot needs to be. to fit around the biggest part. So this is going to be slightly further apart than the last few knots. But again, just holding that center knot and tying this first knot where I want it, then I can move around my netting and do the others as well. Just swapping onto the opposite side. I find it's easier to do opposites and then do the two in between. It just helps your netting to stay a bit more even. Holding onto that center knot and then tying this knot down about the same distance away as the other knot. And then you're going to do the two ones in between as well, trying to make sure they're about the same distance apart as well. Making sure your knots are pulled nice and tight, and then in between each layer you can check your jar size onto your netting and just make sure that it's traveling okay. If it's not, it's super simple now just to undo the knots and redo them in the right place. Otherwise you're going to get too far through it and it might not fit. So just checking it on there and sort of pulling it up, making sure it's fitting on there nicely with that center knot right at the base. This is coming along really well, and I'm going to be able to just see where the knots need to be as well. So while it's on there, I'm just going to hold them into place, and then I know where my next knot needs to be. So just holding onto that center knot and just pulling so that it's going to be nice and even, tying that knot and then going on to the opposite side as well. And then the in-between knots as well, pulling one out of each side, making sure you're knotting the ones next to each other together. It does get a little bit complex when there's lots of threads going everywhere, but just making sure you're knotting those ones next to each other. Just ready to check your glass inside the netting again. Now I'm almost at the top. I can start to pull my threads upwards and just see how they're going to sit. So you can sort of start to see whether you need more knots or whether you're actually getting to the point where you've got enough knots and you're going to just secure your netting at the top. You will also have two threads that are nice and long that your jar is going to be able to hang off, and then you should have quite a few other threads that are quite short. So just bringing those longer ones aside. So there's my two nice long threads. Then I'm going to tie these opposite threads together, just two of the shorter ones to secure them, and that's going to secure your jar in place. I just tie them in a simple knot and then another simple knot again, and that just helps to secure our jar. Then doing the same with the two opposite sides as well. Then you're going to be able to sort of put your cuttings in, and that will help to stand them up in there as well. Then we can just snip all these shorter tails off, making sure not to snip the longer ones that you're going to hang your jar from. But all of these shorter ones can get cut off nice and tidy. You should still have your two longer threads coming up, so I'm just going to bring them upwards and tie a little knot at the top there as well to secure them in place. And then you can pop some water in and find some cuttings to add to your little propagating jar. Perfect for just putting little cuttings in and watching the roots sprout. so that you can plant them in the garden.